Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Good morning. We're just going to wait one more minute to let everyone in the room. Okay, we're just going to get started now. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are located. My name is Susan Aaronson, and I am a professor at the George Washington University, and I direct the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, as well as I am co-PI at the NIST NSF Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society. And we have many partners in this webinar, and I don't want to list them all, but I wanted to thank Inside US Trade and the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and of course the Minderoo Foundation, which has enabled us to put on these webinars this year. So with that, I will get started. I have a little intro, which I usually don't do, but I think it's important to do that today. So in 1997, you may remember there was a president then named Bill Clinton, and he described governing the internet and its data flows as nailing Jell-O to the wall. And maybe Jell-O's not the right analogy for where we are today, but his administration understood that the data flows that underpin the internet would need some sort of shared principles, norms, and then rules. And so in 1997, the Clinton administration set out the framework for global e-commerce. And that framework underpins every e-commerce and digital trade agreement. And it said, the US government supports the broadest possible free flow of information across international borders. The administration will develop an informal dialogue with key trading partners to ensure that differences in national regulation do not serve as disguised trade barriers. That principle has guided U.S. policy for some 25 years, underpinning the OECD principles and, of course, the e-commerce agreements that followed. They also influenced other nations' approaches to digital economy agreements and digital trade agreements. But in late October, a week or two ago, trade journalists reported that the Biden administration would end its support for proposals on data flows, data localization, and source code being discussed in the World Trade Organization. Trade officials stated that they needed policy space, and many people said they wanted to give space for the FTC to regulate various platforms. But the news was surprising to many people, including me, because of that history that I just outlined and because of recent U.S. actions at various venues, including the G7, the Democracy Summit, where the U.S. talked about the free flow of information. Moreover, the language of policy space was reminiscent of what India said when it was trying to explain why it did not join the Joint Statement Initiative. So today we have four very thoughtful people to discuss, explain what's going on. Our speakers are Jonathan McHale, who is to the left of me, and he is Vice President, Digital Trade, the Computer and Communications Industry Association, and he will go first. Kieron Patel, who is the head of digital trade for North America and the EU at the Department for Science, Innovation, and Technology, and that department negotiates trade agreements now for the British government. Then we have Burcu Kilic, who is Senior Fellow, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And then we have Nigel, who is the Associate Director for Trade Policy, Information Technology, and Innovation Foundation. So I have a few questions for them, but this webinar is for you, and I bet you have lots of questions for them. Please, whenever you're ready, start putting them in the Q&A, and at 11:30, we'll start asking them. So let's begin with you, Jonathan. How do you explain the Biden administration decision?
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for organizing this really important seminar. This really is a very important pivot point in policy, I think. And I think to your answer, if you want to look at a coherent policy decision, you can't explain it. And you can't for the very reasons that you outlined, which is, on the one hand, you've got the administration last year signing, or a couple of years ago, signing Declaration on the Future of the Internet. Last summer, you had the finalization of the privacy framework with the EU, which is premised on the value of moving data. You have, USMCA, which passed only 2 years ago, which was overwhelmingly supported by members on both sides of the aisle in Congress, supporting these very rules that the administration is now backed off from. So I think from a coherence perspective, you can't explain it. What one can perhaps say is that this is an effort to appease a small constituency that just doesn't like rules at all, and are picking a target, a misguided attempt to pick a target that is disfavored in certain policy circles, and an attempt to undermine it. And I say misguided because these rules are not really just about technology companies. They're not really about big companies necessarily. Rules, which have been developed over 10 years, reflect the fact that digitization of the economy has been spreading throughout every sector, and that the benefits of data and the benefits of protecting intellectual property extend to all these participants. And so the notion that this is simply a gift to one subset of the economy is just wrong. If you look at the US export statistics, 600 billion of trade of exports is supported by what the Bureau of Economic Analysis calls digitally enabled services. That's 2.5% of the GDP. So a policy that basically undermines what is supporting 2.5% of US GDP really is not well considered. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Kieron, did you want to say anything, or should we hold off right now?
Sorry, no, I was trying to find the unmute button. No, happy for other panel members to go.
Okay, Burcu?
Okay, yeah, I mean, contrary to Jonathan, I view USTR's decision as a positive development. I believe it's a step forward, not back. And to frame our discussion, I like to reflect on a crucial experience that really shaped my position on digital trade. Like 10 years ago, everyone here would remember, like the US was negotiating the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And I think at that time, Jonathan was at the USTR. So I was following the TPP negotiations very closely because of the IP chapter. And there was very, very little discussion on e-commerce. Especially in the official negotiation rounds, no one was talking about the e-commerce chapter, but there was a noticeable buzz here in DC. And the problem was that chapter was not considered a controversial chapter. It was never leaked, so we didn't necessarily know the specifics of those provisions. But then, interestingly, back in the 2014, and you would remember this, Susan, the TISA, like the Trade and Services Agreement, it is a failed trade agreement. The e-commerce chapter of the TISA leaked. And I analyzed the chapter. That was my first interaction with these proposals. And Susan, you would also remember you organized a panel back in 2014 at the IGF USA on TISA, and you invited me to speak and to provide the public interest view of those provisions. And I think that was the first discussion we had. And at that time, I remember making a statement and saying something like, we are on the brink of technological advances as we can't yet predict. And here we are setting the rules that might box us in. So that was my position almost 10 years ago. And it's still my position now. And that's really stayed with me all those years. So since then, the tech landscape has changed a lot. I mean, you would remember 10 years ago, like social media was for fun, to connect with your friends, and we didn't have ChatGPT. At that time, when we talk about data flows, we were thinking, like we were making that natural assumption that the data was flowing to the US, but things have changed in the last 10 years. And those rules at that time, they were made like behind closed doors. I know it's very like typical when we talk about trade agreements, but literally like, because I was there at the rounds and I didn't know anything about the specifics of those provisions in the e-commerce chapter because there was no discussion. And then the TPP, I mean, although US withdrew from the TPP, it became a blueprint for all the free trade agreements or all the digital trade or e-commerce chapters that came after it, including the USMCA. And it was the same challenge with the USMCA. There were some discussions, but to be honest, like in the USMCA, we had to pick the battles, and the bigger battle was the biologics exclusivity and the pharma monopolies. And you would remember towards the very end, Nancy Pelosi raised some concerns about the digital trade chapter, but it was too late. So what I'll say is there hasn't been a discussion on these provisions, and these provisions were made a decade ago, long before we had these challenges. As I said, I see the USTR's position as a positive development. I see that as the recognition of changing digital landscape and also the need for up-to-date policies, which reflects the Biden administration priorities, such as the worker-centric trade policy, the regulation of AI, privacy, and competition. So this is a step back. This is not a step back. This is a step forward. And I really, really hope that it will inspire or other trading partners who put these provisions in their FTAs. And it will be a step forward to a just and resilient digital society.
Thank you for your comments, Burcu. Nigel?
Yeah. Firstly, thanks, Susan. Always appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on something that I know you and I and the rest of us love looking into. I suppose, not surprisingly, I disagree with, Burcu's assessment. I mean, she makes some interesting points for us to consider, but that we've now been talking about these provisions, many of which have been not only sort of known, but enacted and brought to life for some years now in the TPP or the CPTPP, even without the US's absence, and the fact that these countries have still been able to enact updated laws and regulations on privacy, competition, digital content, and other issues unaffected. Gets to the central point that we've long made about these digital trade agreements, is that they don't prevent countries from enacting legitimate updated laws on these issues, and that this has been borne out by fact in terms of how these agreements have been used, and the fact that more countries continue to want to join these agreements would give evidence to the fact that these agreements these provisions on data and digital trade and such are completely in alignment with how a wide range of policymakers, beyond just the CPTPP to Korea, to Taiwan, to the UK and others who want to join the CPTPP, in part because its rules around data reflect best practice. And so I think that's what we've seen there. And so I think to Jonathan's point, again, I suppose we're reliving history again in terms of the same types of arguments and oppositions to these provisions that we've seen reflected in USTR Thai's decision at the WTO, where its other members are engaged in good faith, constructive negotiations about how do they find the balance between protecting data flows involved in commercial activities and detailing sort of narrow exceptions that obviously allow legitimate policies. And that, I mean, you'd think that's where the United States would want to be in ensuring that its voice is heard and where to draw that line. And instead, they've just simply walked away from it. I think essentially reflecting the fact that in this regards, this opposition to digital trade is a proxy for their goals in other parts of the debates that we have here in DC around competition, antitrust, privacy, and such. I suppose, and so basically, this core issue, which the US leads on in terms of the digital economy, is held hostage to the views of a small group. I mean, I was just reading before we came online, there was a joint letter from the New Democrats. There was a statement from Senator Coons. There's a sort of a long and growing list of concerns from Congress that reflect that this issue is not one that should be held hostage to one particular issue. This has broad relevance. This cuts across many US interests and initiatives. And so I think it's especially disappointing because there's like legitimate debates to be had about where to draw these lines to support trade while protecting legitimate laws and regulations. But instead of engaging that, USTR has just walked away. And I think, I mean, also the news reports this morning that essentially USTR is confirming that it's no longer in the business in making digital rules and that there will be no digital trade announcement at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework meeting or negotiations being held in San Francisco on the margins of the APEC leaders meeting next week. And so in the meantime, I suppose the US's approach has already had an impact. I mean, we've seen reports in China, in India, and then obviously also more immediately in Geneva in terms of countries having to recalibrate where they thought the US would help and where talks were leading. And so regardless of what comes next from the Biden administration, USTR Thai's decision on this will have a broad ripple effect that will be hard to sort of like undo.
Thank you for those comments. I think everybody would like to engage on this one more time, but let me ask Kieron a clarifying question. Why don't the exceptions allow for policy space, or do the exceptions?
Sorry, I didn't catch the beginning of your question.
So in almost all digital trade agreements or e-commerce agreements, there are exceptions to the rules, right? And so a nation could ask for source code as example in a state of national security emergency, for example, or terrorism. They could break the source code on, you know, a phone that was designed and produced in another country, thereby, you know, breaking the rules. Why don't the exceptions, in your opinion, offer enough policy space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I'd first of all, I'd just like to clarify where DSETs sit in Whitehall.
Please.
Department of Science, Innovation and Technology are responsible for the policy area and its ownership, and we work closely with our colleagues in the Department for Business and Trade, who, amongst other things, negotiate FTAs. I think other panel members have done a good job at explaining why this problem has come about, and as a civil servant, I don't think it's helpful for me to speculate on internal US political and policy discussions. And we're aware of the paper that Elizabeth Warren has written, and the decisions that USTR has come to by virtue. But with respect to any other government, we certainly respect their right to require adequate policy space as they see fit and come to solutions on their own domestic policy and challenges as they see fit. So whether or not I personally agree with the way they go about it, we ultimately respect their need to. With that said, we are aware of the debate about data and trade policy in relation to domestic policy, and we have had our own internal debates. And I thought it might be helpful to set out the UK's position, which hopefully should answer your question. The UK has attempted to combine our commitment to data flows as well as the attempt to balance it with safety, trust, competition throughout our own domestic and regulatory landscape. And this is clear in our commitments in the UK data strategy, which is publicly available. And we set out our approach on data flows in this strategy. It was written by, published by DCMS, which was the Department for Digital, and that was our predecessor department, and now Science, Innovation and Technology are responsible for this area. Mission 5 is regarding championing the international free flow of data, and it discusses the importance of data flows across border and in order to support economic development and global cooperation. But we make really clear that we are committed to removing barriers to data flows. And I've said this around a negotiating table with other countries and like-minded partners who have opined. We certainly see unjustified barriers to cross-border data flows as a de facto barrier to trade. And as such, we should be doing our part to make sure we remove those. Those, of course, haven't come without controversy or debate, but I think that's a good sort of starting point as to where we stand, or at least certainly I do in my position here.
Thank you so much for that answer. Really appreciate it. Do you mind if I want to remind the audience that please put your questions in the Q&A because we're going to get to them soon and we really want to hear from you. Jonathan, would you like to make some comments in response to the comments that you heard?
Sure. The one thing that I think is unclear when the administration talks about policy space is exactly what could be proposed that would be inconsistent with the rules that are being developed. Policy space is built into trade agreements. If you look at the preamble of any trade agreement, it talks about the right to regulate. The exceptions are premised on the notion that there are times when one does have to take measures that are inconsistent. I, for the life of me, cannot figure out how a data flow restriction has anything to do with a competition issue. Same thing with many of the other provisions. In fact, one would think that it is pro-competitive to allow particularly smaller companies to be able to move data outside of the US to reach their customers. A data localization provision would, as a general matter, disproportionately affect a smaller company that can't afford to necessarily build a data center in every country it chooses. So these are provisions that are pro-competition, not anti-competition. You're helping smaller companies be able to reach a global audience. In terms of the other issue that could appear in some of these debates, the notion that the US might want to put forward a privacy rule, and one would be concerned that a rule on data flows could constrain that. I think the easy answer to that is the agreements that have been negotiated and finalized so far are with some of the countries that have the most robust privacy protections in the globe. So if you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand, you look at Canada, some of the Latin American companies, all very robust privacy regimes. Many of those are deemed adequate by the EU, sort of the pinnacle of privacy concerns. So the notion that you can't find the policy space to have robust privacy protections and have a rule that allows data to move, it just doesn't make sense. And again, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we reached a deal with the EU on the ability to move data between the EU and the US, and again, that was premised on the fact that we do have robust. There is an ability to integrate robust protections and still allow data to move.
Thank you for that. Burcu, did you want to respond? And I also want to bring in this question that someone had for you, because I think you can combine the responses. So Nick from the Jacques Delors Institute in Paris said, how do you explain that the EU, arguably the most advanced regulator of the digital economy, is increasingly negotiating binding rules on data flows and data localization? So it's akin to what Jonathan just asked.
Yeah, sure.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
Okay, no, I'm happy to answer.
I
But
appreciate
before that, I'd like to talk a little bit about this about the rules and the exceptions and how exceptions the current exceptions, at least, like, in existing free trade agreements, they don't necessarily provide policy space. I mean, we talk about the source code provision, and I think everyone in the audience is familiar with that provision. It first appeared in the TPP, and it changed a lot throughout the time, like the CP, now it's CPTPP. CPTPP provision it was the first provision that we saw on that issue. And at the USMCA, the US negotiators, I assume, they updated the exception, but the exception is still not good enough, like, because as I said, these rules are made a decade ago, and at that time we didn't have the AI, like the threat of AI, let me put it in that way, because we had AI, we knew that AI was coming, but we didn't know what was coming. So, and we didn't have the problems with the large language models, ChatGPT, and most importantly, we didn't have an appetite to regulate these technologies. Now we have a global interest and a political will to regulate the AI-related technologies. And there was a summit, and also the timing of the USTR's announcement is quite, like, significant. It just came before the Biden's administration's executive order on AI. So one thing that I want to highlight there, Susan, you would remember you organized a webinar back in May on generative AI, and one of your colleagues was talking about the large language models and how to set standards for the large language models. And he said in that webinar that it is very important to access the data that trains these models and to be able to access that process which the models were generated is important. And he said that as researchers, they need to access to that data sets to be able to set standards. He said we need an insider view of what's going on. Otherwise, we won't be able to set the standards. So you look at the USMCA or the USMCA exception, and I know that exception has been has been modified in other free trade agreements. I think the UK FTAs have a different exceptions. Like, it's a little bit of modified language, but none of those exceptions include the researchers' goal. None of those exceptions go beyond the regulatory or judicial authorities. Even with the regulatory authorities, it is very restrictive. And something we know about the exceptions is, like, the exceptions should be interpreted strictly. That's the rule in trade law. That's what I learned when I first started my career as a trade lawyer. Like, so the exceptions should be interpreted very strictly. So we can't come up with a broad exception. So that those languages, they don't necessarily accommodate researchers like David, Like who wants to set the standards for these large language models and who needs access to data sets, not only the source code algorithms, but also the data sets. So that's one challenge, you know. But another challenge and the problem with the data flows is like, so the question is where the data flows. Like we make that assumption that the data is flowing to the US, but there was a recent study from McHale, I think it was end of 2020, saying that the China became a global data powerhouse. 20% of like global data flows is going to China. And that's almost the double of the percentage of data flows coming to the US. So we make that assumption that data is flowing here, but actually data is flowing through China. I mean, like apparently like the kids now spend 90 minutes, like the average, on TikTok, you know, and as I said, when we made these rules, there was no TikTok, there was no like China is a global data powerhouse. China was like a distant threat. So things have changed, and we really need to think about these recent developments and the evolving nature of technology. And coming back to the question on the EU FTAs have a different exception, which is not acceptable for the US. Like all those FTAs have the position, the EU exception, which is generally called, which is not acceptable for the US, and that's why like the negotiating parties at the WTO's GCI, they couldn't make any progress on this issue because EU has a very strong position on the exception language.
But Burcu, just to press you a little further, since this is something I write about all the time, I want to summarize what you said. So you're essentially saying that the current exceptions don't offer sufficient policy space, as example, for explainability as required under GDPR and other EU regulations and perhaps other countries' regulations. But there is no generative AI without web scraping. I mean, let's hope that we get better at synthetic data. But until we do, you know, in a sense, because of that, you know, the United States is going to be crippling an industry, and you know, maybe that shouldn't take dominance, but do we, you know, the implications for generative AI as a public good are also going to be hampered if we don't believe in the free flow of information. So I don't want to put you on the spot. Maybe everybody can address the implications of that. Do you want to go first, or should I turn to Nigel first?
Yeah, I mean, let's hear from Nigel. I'm curious.
Okay.
No,
Nigel and Kieron, you are up.
Yeah, no, so an interesting development in that, and I think it highlights how, I mean, for a fact that USTR's decision was not well communicated or coordinated with other parts of the administration, never mind Congress, and how USTR's perspective is not reflected in other parts of the Biden administration agenda. Like the Biden administration AIEO it just does not relate to the world that USTR's decision sort of is heading us towards. And in fact, actually taken to its logical extreme, as we see obviously in China, which pushes for exactly this broad self-judging policy space so it can enact restrictions on data that allow it to do all sorts of things, both economically, politically, and socially, that it fundamentally undermines, obviously, Biden administration goals when it comes to both supporting the development of AI, but it also undermines the ability to govern AI across borders. And so data is obviously a critical input to AI. And so creating a world where the internet becomes further fragmented, whether it's on data lines or AI regulatory lines, means that our job and policymakers' jobs of both supporting and reasonably regulating it just gets that much harder. And so I think the disconnect from the Biden administration AIEO is reflective of the fact that USTR's decision also just cuts across so many different other US interests and initiatives, whether it be on the as Jonathan said, the EU-US data privacy framework, the global cross-border privacy rules system, the MLAT systems, Cloud Act agreements, and other issues which are based on the premise that legal responsibilities can travel with the data, that governments can come up with agreements to enact sufficient guardrails and safeguards around it while still allowing data to flow freely, which ultimately, taken to its sort of strategic level, this perspective about rights respecting data flows was at the heart of US efforts to counter China's digital governance model, which is obviously far more restrictive and far more repressive from a human rights perspective. And so we'll have, just on that point alone, we'll have global ramifications. And so I think, I mean, the AI question is an interesting one because it's the focus of policy leaders at the global level at the moment. And so, again, this will ripple out and will, unless there's further clarification or even walk back on it, like policymakers' jobs to develop reasonable rules in around AI and associated issues will only get that much harder if data isn't able to flow as it should.
Thank you, Nigel. Kieron, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point that you made on the synthetic data point is excellent. I've actually been speaking to a few colleagues on that. But as Nigel said, things such as AI, the quality of AI is increasingly depending on the quality of the data used. And I would point to our own Online Safety Act as an example of recognizing the need for legislation to support the safety of adults and children online, whilst also recognizing the need not to have unjust barriers to trade. And further to that, I would also point to the Competitions and Market Authority and the Digital Markets Unit that sits within the CMA, who have also attempted to address this issue as well.
Thank you for those comments. We need to turn to the audience questions, but I will give everybody some time to make some final points. So Melanie Foley of Public Citizen asks, how successful have public interest or other exceptions in past agreements been in, I don't know if you want to say protecting or preserving domestic policy space? Would anyone like to take that one?
I mean, a counter to Burcu's position, like the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreements provisions on source code did not stop the EU from enacting the AI Act, which I presume it and many others regard as sort of the gold standard in sort of terms of legislating regulations around it. And I'll put it in the chat, like Sam Lowe in the UK did this great analysis showing how it certainly impacted the EU's source code provisions, but like it didn't stop it. And its impact was, as you'd expect from a trade perspective, in terms of just ensuring it wasn't going to be misused. And so I think in that case, but also to like the fact we've just seen so many new laws in these countries that have signed up to the CPTPP and that it has not stopped them from doing so is evidence of the fact that policymakers are obviously comfortable with the balance that the CPTPP strikes in this regards, and that it still allows them to do what they think is right in terms of regulating data and new and emerging digital technologies.
Thank you. Anybody else want to address that? Okay, a lot of the questioners want to know the role that China might be playing in this decision. And they cite as example that the United States is introducing measures to protect sensitive data, which is preserved under the exceptions, but nonetheless, this person asks, is the United States introducing measures to protect sensitive data from foreign adversaries? Is that possibly the reason? Does anyone have any sense on that? Want to answer that one?
No, I appreciate the questions in the chat about China and that focus on that. I mean, there are certainly discussions happening in the administration on the Hill or in and around this issue of protecting sensitive US data. I mean, the Biden administration released an EO on it some time ago last year, but I think it would be mistaken, and Jonathan could correct me if I'm wrong, but like this is not, USTR's decision is not tied to some master plan in terms of countering Chinese access to US sensitive data. I see them running in separate tracks. And so, I mean, to that point, I mean, the China question as in and relates to data is an interesting one. I highly suspect it'll be an emerging area of concern following other recent updates around export controls, outbound foreign investment reviews and such, and that data and access to cloud will be fall under the scrutiny. But to that point, if the United States had particular concerns about how, for example, the national security exception might play out, like it would be far better for them to be engaged in further elaborating and detailing that exception, given their concerns, than just walking away from the table when they now don't have any say over what those provisions might look like.
Jonathan, do you want to add anything here?
Sure. No, I would agree that the sensitive data, particularly with respect to China, would certainly be covered by the national security exception. Certainly in the IPEF context, China's not a party, so it's not like these rules would create rights vis-a-vis China. In the WTO, when I was participating in that forum, there was great interest in making sure that one didn't necessarily create rights for China if they weren't going to live up to the obligation as well. It wasn't resolved because of discussion over how you deal with MFN, but there's certainly a strong interest in making sure that, certainly with respect to things that do come close to national security issues, that this wouldn't tie the hands of a government. I will also say that, I mean, many privacy regimes do have gradated obligations based on the nature of the sensitivity of the data, whether it's health data, sexual orientation, political views, etc. And that's accepted. It's accepted that you have different regimes that address those types of specific concerns. And what it means from a trade rule perspective is, there's a higher bar, both to invoke the restriction, but also as a defense for the country that it would be opposing that type of a restriction.
Thank you. Burcu, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I like to get back to the discussion about the exceptions, and I think that's a very important discussion, because we are talking about trade rules. So there are obligations, then there are exceptions, and exceptions is the problematic part for us, because the existing exceptions in the US FTAs, USMCA, like that's the only one which passed which passed Congress. Like they don't necessarily create policy space, and this has been written. There is a huge literature out there, So I can come up with like 50 examples how they restrict the policy space, especially now. And as I said, like these rules are made like a decade ago. I mean, Jonathan can confirm when the TPP e-commerce chapter was first tabled in the TPP negotiations. But I remember from my discussions with the TPP negotiators, it was one of the few chapters which was concluded earlier than 2015. They were just discussing the exception language, privacy exception language. That was the last issue remaining in that chapter. So we are talking about rules which are made in 2013, 14, like let's say 15, like almost a decade ago. Like the technology has changed, and those exceptions, which might be enough at that time, and they weren't. Like if you look back, and if you look at the public interest analysis of those tags, you will see that the exceptions were not enough at that time because of the way they were formulated, like because they were based on the general exception. They borrowed the language from the general exception. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but we have enough like trade experts on this panel. They can talk more about the problem with the general exceptions. But the issue is like those extra exceptions are not enough now, like, you know. So I see this move, the USTR's move, as a positive development. This is good for us. This is good for the broader tech policy. That I see that as a move to synchronize the trade policy with tech policy. So, like, I remember the discussions back in 2014. There was no discussion of tech policy or tech regulation. Things have changed, and I think we are getting on somewhere, and that future looks positive. So we should be really like proud of the USTR, because I think we will get to that thoughtful approach, thoughtful trade policy approach to the digital trade or e-commerce, whatever you call. And the discussions like this are very useful. And thanks for bringing us together, Susan. You know, because these discussions will craft the policies for the future. And I have to say, like, you know, like when I was at the foundation, I created a fund on extended reality. So we think about we talk about the technology now, and we say that, oh my God, the technology, AI. And let me tell you, like, the future doesn't look that bright. Like, the future technologies are more concerning, and we can address those problems with the rules which are made in the 2010s. So let's take this as an opportunity. And let's have more discussions. Let's have a, you know, multi-stakeholder, like a discussion about the trade policy, trade and tech policy. And I'm sure we'll get to a better place than we are now.
So what I'm hearing you say is really technology policy needs to be decided before we can move forward on trade policy. But I just want to press everybody on this. So you're probably familiar with the debate in generative AI between open source models, and this is total bullshit to one extent, because there's always some trade secret or IPR protected element. But, you know, open source models, you know, if we're talking truly open source, we're talking about the algorithm being open and the data being open. And how can that be if there isn't greater access to, you know, you can't make that data set as accurate, complete, and representative as possible unless you have access to global stores of information. Now, granted, if there's only 12% of a country online, you're not really getting a good sample of that country's data anyway. But doesn't it lead to real human rights violations and real, you know, not only could it impede access to information, if other countries follow along these lines. It's not the same as the Great Firewall, right? But it seems to really impede things that the United States has set a priority. So I'm a little confused. You know, these were things laid out in the Democracy Summit. These are things that the United States shares with other governments. Now, granted, you can diss what I just said, anybody can, by saying, well, as Burcu said, which I think quite rightly, we need to figure out how are we going to govern these platforms and how are we going to govern the technology that they're coming up with. We can't foresee it. We can't adopt a systemic approach. But without access to that data, which I think only trade rules can provide, aren't we screwing many of the objectives that we as a country have? I don't know. Kieron, do you want to weigh in? No?
I'd be interested to get Nigel's thoughts, actually.
You what?
I'd be interested to get Nigel's thoughts.
No, I think to go even further back in time is like, we have to recognize like data, the free flow of data is foundational to the open internet, and that it's in terms of timeliness, like it's something that we haven't not addressed in any systemic fashion since the internet was created. And so we're playing catch up there already. But the fact of the matter is that policymakers can walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of figuring out domestic rules and regulations for new and emerging technologies and related issues, while recognizing that there's a clear trade element embedded in it, and that there's a way to square the circle there. And that's how the rules and exceptions are defined. And that's how, I mean, the European Union, Japan, Korea and others, like highly sophisticated regulatory regimes can see this, that they can do both the domestic and the international at the same time. And that I think that the smartest ones of them are doing it in exactly that way, but also in a proactive sense that before they've even enacted laws and regulations, they're talking with their trading partners to ensure that they're already in early alignment. And that's what we've seen with Australia and Singapore and Chile and New Zealand with their respective digital economy partnership agreements, is that as they're figuring out their domestic approach on AI or whatever it may be, that they can talk with their partners to be like, oh, how can we all generally head in the same direction on these issues as we're enacting domestic laws and regulations, because it becomes much harder to build genuine global governance of these issues retrospectively once highly restrictive domestic regulatory frameworks have been enacted, and then you're trying to like piece them together and build bridges between what could be vastly different systems. And that bridging task will only get harder the more that we create policy space, quote unquote, for any and all sorts of manners of restrictions that are used as cover for other purposes. And so the job of folks working on AI governance and other new issues like will only get harder if the underlying issue around data can't be resolved in a way that it's essentially taken care of. And so I don't see how we can build these subsequent forms of cooperation if we can't even get to agreement on this underlying foundational issue, that is data and its movement across an open internet.
Can I ask everybody if everybody can stay for 4-ish more minutes beyond? I want to just make sure we get to answer a few more of the questions, but I see your hands up, and we'll you can, when I call on you for this question, because I'm going to both of you. So Lori Wallach from Rethink Toyd asks, excuse me, I said Toyd, her trade. She says, the WTO essential security exception is not self-judging, as the US learned the hard way a few months ago. So at the WTO, there's no reliable national security exception that would cover US policies to keep data from China. I don't think that's correct, but I don't know for sure. Jonathan, do you want to take Lori's question on?
Sure. In the digital space, I'm not unaware of any case that's been decided that would put a constraint over the type of activity that that you're pointing to. In the WTO context, as well as in free trade agreements, the national security exception is crafted differently. I don't think in the WTO context we know what exception would necessarily attach to the rule. But again, the key issue here is China party to the set of rules that folks are pulling together? If they're not party, they don't have rights. And therefore it's kind of irrelevant just to suggest that the rule would require data necessarily to go to China. I would like to jump back to one of the points that that Nigel was making on the expanding the exception and having that be basically a vehicle for fragmenting the regulatory approach to data generally. That is the obvious consequence. If you say governments ought to have this broad exception to have heterogeneous rules regarding this, you are going to have a balkanized global ecosystem. One of the consequences of that is some of the very goals that people are trying to articulate, whether it's safety, whether it's quality of data, whether it's explainability, etc., will be diminished. They'll be diminished because you're not having countries coalesce around a common view of what are the boundaries for where you ought to come in and regulate and where not. And that is not in the interest of any nation that is interested in a coherent approach to dealing with common goals that no one disagrees with. People do not disagree that you ought to protect privacy, you ought to protect security, you ought to have AI be explainable. The question is, how do you have global norms that show how you get there in a way that doesn't create a balkanized world where everyone going in a different direction means you don't come up to that common goal.
Okay, Kieron, did you want to say anything?
No, I think Jonathan hit the nail on the head there. I think ensuring that we don't have knee-jerk reactions and we ask the important questions both on the global and domestic side, irrespective of the trade agreements we've signed up to, is really, really important.
Thank you. Dr. Kilic?
Thank you. I mean, I want to I want to chime in on one of the points Nigel made about the policy space and our trading partners introducing rules on issues like privacy, competition. I mean, I remember when GDPR first entered into force, the US, like at that time, I think it was 2018, 2017, 2018. It was the Trump administration, and at that time, US Secretary of Commerce called the GDPR as a non-tariff barrier. And very recently, there was a letter from I think from the CCIA about the DSA and DMA, both of them, like, you know, calling them as the non-tariff barriers and barriers for trade. And in discussions related to digital trade, something I observed, like people tend to compare Europe and China as digital protectionist countries. So Europe has all these regulations, but like in trade discussions, in digital trade discussions, it's almost at the same place as China when it comes to digital protectionist regime. And Susan, you have a paper on that, and I really like your paper. And you say that digital protectionism is easy to call, hard to define. You know, it's like it's very hard to define. So it's hard to know like whether the countries have policy space. I mean, I remember USTR like in criticizing South Korea for the regulations on app space, like the app market, like. So there are examples that the countries try to introduce regulations, and then they receive a reaction from the US industry. And back in the day, it was USTR2 that no, these are digital protectionist policies. These create like non-tariff barriers. So it's not easy to say countries are free and they have policy space. And these countries are the powerful countries, global north countries, and there is also a global south part of it. Like, and I can tell you lots of examples of that. Like, you know, when countries wanted to introduce privacy rules, like the first thing they hear from the U.S. trade representatives was like, no, it will create a trade barrier, non-tariff trade barrier.
But
so,
isn't that because the U.S. lacks personal data protection?
Yeah,
rules?
I mean,
so they're hamstrung. I mean, what would you have them do? And this is a question Lori asked as well, and other people have asked. You know, like, we're not going to hit EU rules, and we're lucky in some ways because we have an opportunity to address collective privacy. Since in truth, what we're talking about with AI is collective privacy because we're analyzed in groups, and that needs to be addressed. But, you know, what are they to do in the absence of a law? And so on one hand, they need to ask for policy space. But on the other hand, you can't, you know, like US agreements say minimal level, right? So, you know, you just have to have some form of personal data protection. What's the middle ground? Like, what would be an acceptable middle ground?
Is it a question for me? I can.
Yeah. What do you think?
For an hour, like, you know, and I've been very, very, very vocal about the need for federal privacy law and federal privacy protection. Unfortunately, it's not going anywhere. But in the AI space, there are good developments. I think the executive order is not enough, it's not great, but it's a good start. And I think it's good that we are having that discussion, and the standards for AI, which you've been working on, like that's a good start. But there are problems that we need to address, such as the trade secret protection for algorithms and source code. I mean, I'm writing a paper on trade secrets, and it is a big problem. You know, it's a global problem, not a problem for the US, but also a problem for the other countries, because the trade secrets, it's not an IP right. Like, you know, you can't really qualify as an IP right like in international law. It's not regulated in the TRIPS agreement. So there are problems, and we need to address these problems. That's why we need more discussions. We need the policy space to make the rules so that our trade policy can move. And until then, I think the trade policy, trade rules will create barriers, and we saw this. Like we saw this with the letters that the industry sent to USTR criticizing countries like regulations such as the DMA, DSA, GDPR, like Korean app, like the regulation. You know, these were all called as non-tariff barriers. So instead of focusing on non-tariff barriers, we should really get things done in our tech policy. So I think this is a good beginning. And then, as I said, this is a positive development. It's not a step back, it's a step forward, and we will get to a better place.
Thank you for those comments. Okay, we're at 12:02, so I'm going to ask everybody to take 30 seconds to sum up. I'm also going to apologize to everybody whose question was not answered. And that's the problem with having an hour-long thing. But why don't we start with Kieron? Do you want to make some final points?
Sure. I think we've digressed from the reason we wanted to make the point, which I didn't quite get to make earlier, is I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think the US have just given themselves some policy space at the moment, and it's important. I would draw parallels to the way TPP was at the beginning, where they pulled out, and we saw a fantastic agreement at the end of it. So I think, yeah, I'm interested to see how this evolves over the coming weeks, months, and years. If there's a change of administration, how the policy position changes. And as I think everyone on this panel said, these sorts of discussions are a really great place to start. Yeah, I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Kieron. Nigel?
So a few quick points. The irony of the fact that the three core provisions that USTR announced it was opposed to on data flows, data localization, and source code were all initially proposed to counteract harmful and regressive policies in China. And that, for example, like data, obviously, data localization enables sort of authoritarian governments easier access to personal data for surveillance and censorship purposes. Undermining source code essentially allows them to both steal IP, but also circumvent the encryption that is most commonly used, thus allowing them even easier access. And so the fact that the US has obviously made countering restrictive and repressive Chinese digital policies a centerpiece of its foreign policy, and that they're walking away from it is no shortness of irony. Secondly, the core point in all of this and is the central principle that the WTO is built on, that being of non-discrimination. If the US enacted a new data privacy law or even a new competition law, it would be fine as long as it's non-discriminatory. That if it applies to all foreign and domestic firms alike, that would be fine. And that's at the heart of US concerns about the DMA and the DSA, is that it doesn't apply evenly. It selectively picks out its targets. And that's a central defining feature of digital trade agreements, and that they're trying to extend this long-held principle of the WTO and bring it into the digital world. But that runs directly counter to what USTR, TAI, and others want to do, and they want US laws and other countries' laws to purposely target US quote-unquote big tech. Anyway, and thanks again, as always, Susan, for pulling this.
Thank you, Nigel. Jonathan?
Sure, just a couple points. You know, point of having trade rules is not to force another country to do something in particular. You can't. The countries are sovereign. If they're going to take a measure that is inconsistent with the rule, then they can do that, and there's some penalties, but it can't prevent governments from doing what they choose to do. What it can do is provide a level of accountability, so that if you put in a rule, you have to explain it, and you have to explain it on principles that are very core to certainly the U.S. approach to governance, which is that they're not arbitrary, that they're justified, and they're not generally discriminatory. So I think that the notion that that a desire for policy space is inconsistent with U.S. policy is just dead wrong. It's fundamental to the way we develop regulation as a general matter. The second point is that these rules, I think, are again, they if the argument is that they are constraining ongoing policy decisions being made in the US, it's really incumbent on folks making that argument to describe precisely where a potential inconsistency is and where the constraint would lie. This is not about regulation generally. Trade rules are very narrow. They're narrow in their effect, and they're narrow on the degree to which they constrain a particular regulation. And AI is a case in point. I mean, as is competition, none of this generally intersects with the trade rules. And therefore, if quote unquote policy space is the rationale for pulling back, it really is incumbent on advocates of that to explain exactly where there is a conflict, particularly to find a solution beyond just simply saying we're going to walk away.
Okay, Burcu?
Okay, I mean, I'll say that, you know, the very nature of trade law is dynamic, it's not static. And we have seen this before, you know, this adaptability is not a new concept. And we have seen these policy shifts, like especially in trade law before. I mean, for instance, US used to have a very strong position on investment, on ISDS mechanisms or biologics exclusivity. But USTR adopted its position based on the public opinion and Congress, like the opinion, the position of Congress. So this is not a new thing for the US trade policy. As I said in the beginning, I will say it again. This is not a step back. This is a step forward, and we will get to a better place than we used to be. And then hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll look back and we said, okay, we did the right thing. And I think we should owe a big thanks. And I'm so like, you know, I'm so like, I mean, I have to say, I never thought that I would say that. Like, I would never say that we should be thankful to the USTR, like based on my like advocacy all those years. But I have to say, like, we should be thankful to the USTR for taking this step and saying that, okay, let's take a deep breath and approach this step by step, and then we'll see what's coming next. And these discussions, as I said, are very, very useful because I really, really like care what Nigel and Jonathan they have to say. You know, they have like, I mean, we don't necessarily agree, but we have like, we respect each other and we have lots to contribute to this debate. I'm hoping that this is a new beginning for the digital trade policy making in the US. So we will have more multi-stakeholder discussions, not only with the industry, civil society, but also with workers, with consumers, with educators, and with technologists, and also the SMEs. So, and then we will come up with better policies, like, you know, better exceptions, because the current exceptions, they don't work for us as of today. Maybe they work for us 10 years ago, but they don't work for us as of today. So this is a new beginning, and let's take advantage of these new beginnings. Beginnings can be scary, but we will get to a better place.
Seeing positive. Thank you all so much for coming and speaking with us. And I apologize to those whose questions we didn't answer. Our next webinar will be on XR in the world and XR competitiveness and what other governments are doing. and why anybody should care about that. And also, please look at our data and generative AI conference, which is coming up December 7th, which is free to all, and hope to see you there. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Mindaru Foundation. Thank you, Kieron, Burcu, Nigel, and Jonathan. We really appreciate your thoughtful responses. I am not Pollyanna, but I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
I